Samrita ji.
Namaste, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on navigating mental illness, a discussion on maintaining success while living with mental illness. My name is Amruta Haude. I work for a global health nonprofit called Partners in Health on mental health programs. I've done my bachelor's and my master's in psychology and my master's in public health, and have spent over the years many periods of time working with Seva International and volunteering. So mental health is very much a part of my academic and professional background and close to my heart and a part of my everyday life as well. So as many of us may know, we just wrapped up May, as the month of May, as Mental Health Awareness Month. So we may have seen a lot of campaigns or different types of materials that were centered around the theme of mental health. And so our webinar topic today is also a very timely one in that context. Many of us may have heard sort of what the definition of mental health is. And a definition that I always like to go back to is one by the World Health Organization, which conceptualizes mental health as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. I really enjoy and appreciate this definition. Often mental illness or mental health challenges are seen as a deficiency or something that is negative, but for many of us listening in today, it may be a part of our everyday lives and a part of who we are and our identities. And so I feel that this definition of mental health really captures that nicely and focuses on acceptance around mental health, having awareness around it, and also how we can continue to live and thrive as part of our daily lives, along with the mental health challenges that are a part of us. In our webinar today, I'm very, very happy to introduce Varun Joshi. Varun is a presidential scholar at the Honors College at Georgia State University in Atlanta. He is majoring in data science, focusing on psychology and AI, certainly an emerging field. He's been passionate about mental health as long as he can remember. He has done lots of work in mental health advocacy, starting support groups in college and high school for kids struggling with mental health challenges, and is working on creating an AI therapist in all the spare time that he has along with these activities. So we're very excited today that Varun will be speaking about his own personal mental health journey, how he has navigated various scenarios in his personal or academic or work life, and strategies and tips for all of us who are listening in today. And we're hoping today's session is really interactive. And so please feel free to share any questions on the Facebook Live, and we will respond to as many as we can here. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Varun.
Thank you so much, Amruta. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm extremely glad that I have this opportunity to talk about mental health, to share my experiences. And so before we get started, I just want to quickly kind of lay out what my talk is going to look like, what the structure is going to look like going forward. So first, I'm just going to give kind of a background on who I am, my story, kind of how I've dealt with mental illness, what my challenges with mental illness have been, and some of the ways I've been able to overcome those challenges. Then in the second part, we're going to move into talking about how students, high school students, middle school students, or college age students can kind of deal with the struggles of mental health. And then the third part is going to be focusing on parents. So how can parents effectively help their kids if their kids are struggling with mental health issues? And the thing is, even if your kid isn't necessarily struggling with a diagnosed mental health illness, Every kid, needs a lot of support, needs love. And here we can kind of talk about what you can do to prevent potential mental health issues from happening, what you can do to make it so that things don't, kind of spiral out of control or anything like that. Just basically, how can you support your kid's mental health in the most productive, best way possible? So with that introduction out of the way, I'll kind of just start diving into my story. So for me, mental health has been something that's been a part of my life for a really long time. So since I was a kid, I had lots of emotional sensitivities. So I remember being as far back as like sixth grade or fifth grade. I would spend like the whole day crying about some small thing that happened. Like someone would say would make one small comment towards me or something, or someone might have given me some kind of look that made me feel like they were mad at me. And then I would be sad the whole day, and I'd have crying spells. I'd have a really hard time dealing with my intense emotions. And pair this with the fact that with my dad's kind of IT job and us being here on a work visa, we moved around a lot in the United States. We moved around 13 times by the time I was only 11 or 11 to 13. So we had moved around a lot. I was always the new kid at school. And also being in America is difficult because a lot of the areas we went to were predominantly white. And so with that, you're going to deal with lots of racism, lots of ignorance. Lots of kids thought that I was a Native American because, I was Indian, and they hadn't actually met people from India before. Like, that's just to give you some idea of like some of the places that we went to. So dealing with a lot of that stuff growing up, being an emotionally sensitive child, having to deal with some, racism when I was growing up, it led me to kind of throughout middle school and throughout my early years of high school, my mental health started to worsen until it really got to a point where it was concerning in my high school years. In my freshman year, I was doing okay, but in my sophomore year was when things started to get really bad. I started to have, very, very intense episodes of sadness. Every single day I would be just crying. I'd be unable to motivate myself to do anything. For the first time, my grades started to slip. I wasn't able to do as well as I wanted in school. I wasn't able to achieve the things that I wanted. And it was very, very difficult for me to interact with people, to deal with bullying that I was facing at school, and all of these things. And all of this culminated in my sophomore year. In March of 2018, it led to a suicide attempt that I made that led me to get hospitalized. And so I was hospitalized in a mental health psychiatric ward for about a week because I was deemed, a threat to myself. And that experience was kind of the turning point for me. After that, I realized, I have to take my mental health seriously. My parents were extremely worried about me because, it was a very terrifying thing to have to go through that. And they also, wanted to help me the best they could. They didn't want things to get to this point again. And so from there, things started to get a lot better. So the first kind of things I focused on after that happened were, going to therapy. So I got a therapist. I started, going there a little bit. At first, I didn't take therapy too seriously until my college years. But in high school, that was kind of the first steps, was just getting involved in therapy. And then my parents were very supportive. They really tried to push me outside of my comfort zone. So the first thing that they did was they just got me to get like a basic job as a lifeguard, at this like gym. So they pushed me to do that. I was really scared to do it. I felt really insecure. I had really low self-esteem. I didn't think I could do it, but they kind of pushed me into doing it. And once I got the job, I gained a little bit of confidence in myself, and I felt a little bit better about who I was. So after taking that small step of, just focusing on getting that one job, I started doing a ton of other small things as well that really helped me grow. Because once I got that initial push from my parents, I kind of took off from there. So I started reading up on like, how do you improve your mental health? And I found a bunch of tips that I slowly integrated over the years. So the first thing I did was meditation. I started with just 5 minutes a day. And, eventually over the years, I built that number up to around 30 minutes a day now. But when I started, it was just 5 minutes a day. I would just sit down, meditate using the free version at the time of the app Headspace. And that started to help me a little bit more. Then I got into exercising, which again helped my self-esteem a little bit. I wasn't so, caught up in my own thoughts all the time because I had things to do. I was going to work, I was exercising, I was practicing meditation. Then incorporated a simple kind of practice of gratitude journaling, which anyone can do. all you do is you just, I still do this to this day, like 7 years later, I just write down, or not 7 years, I think 5 years later. So I just write down 5 things I'm grateful for each day. So that another small, simple thing I started doing each day that really, really helped me be more grateful for the positive things that were in my life. And then slowly as time went on, these things started to kind of compound and help me get better. So this took months and months of me, consistently doing this kind of gratitude journaling, just journaling in general, writing about how I was feeling, what I was going through, um, meditating each day, exercising here and there, eating a little bit healthier. And as I made these changes, my junior year became a lot better. The start of my junior year was extremely good. My grades dramatically improved. I went from being like one of the worst kids in the class who wasn't doing that good to consistently being the best kid in like all of my classes. I was able to attain really high grades, develop good relationships with teachers, and everything was going really well. But at this next part of the journey, I kind of want to highlight because it's important. I want to showcase that mental health recovery isn't a linear path because I had all these improvements. I was doing really well, exercising consistently, eating healthy, journaling, gratitude, meditation. And then in April of that year, about a year after my first suicide attempt, I'd written another suicide note, and I was back in that dark place again. I felt extremely uncomfortable, lots of self-hatred, and again, my parents were extremely worried about me. They had to kind of walk me off, that ledge, help me calm down, help me feel a little bit better. Um, and again, I kind of just went back to square one and started approaching things a little bit differently. So the reason that this happened, at the time was just because I was initially diagnosed with depression, but I didn't know it at the time. I had borderline personality disorder. And because that had gone untreated, while these things helped me a lot and I was able to see a lot of success, the root cause had remained untreated. So I still struggled with difficulties with my mental health. And so the reason I bring this up is I want to highlight mental health recovery is not a linear process. So you can see I did all of these things, I was getting better, but then I had a setback. And it was extremely demoralizing. I'll be honest, it was hard to deal with that. And it's extremely frustrating when you've made all this progress and now you find yourself back in a place that you don't really want to be in. But after this, I continued to push on because, my parents really cared. I knew that they, for them, they wanted me to succeed. And I knew that, kind of like the focus on suicide and suicidality, I knew that that wasn't going to be fair to them. And I knew that I wanted to keep on going because they had put in all this effort for me. And I myself wanted to live a happy, positive life. And I knew it was possible. So it's hard to maintain that hope sometimes, but I pushed through. I started all my practices up again, started taking therapy a little more seriously in my junior year, started taking, into account like what my dreams were, started focusing my ambition on things that I was more passionate about. So I started, a YouTube channel after the end of my junior year about, productivity and stuff like that, that I was really passionate about at the time. I started working on, starting a club at school for people who struggled with mental health issues at the time, because again, this was something I was passionate about. And started a support group there. And so again, fell back into the practice of gratitude, meditation, exercise, eating healthy, kind of got back on the wagon. And again, was doing pretty good in my senior year. I had a lot of things going for me. Again, my grades were really good. I got accepted into all the colleges that I wanted to. I got a full ride to Georgia State. Everything was going really well. And this was, one of the I would say at the time best periods of my life. I was doing extremely happy. But again, February of 2020, right before COVID happened, I again sank into a deep depression out of nowhere, and again found myself with a suicide note in my hand. So again, I want to highlight, even when things are going really well, even when you feel like nothing can go wrong, with mental illness, it's a complicated, weird journey. You don't know what's going to happen. And if you find yourself back in that dark place, at that time when I found myself there, I didn't know why. I felt like I had everything I'd wanted. I was doing everything I wanted to do, and it made no sense to me at the time. And it was an extremely difficult and again, demoralizing experience. But the first time that happened, had I not pushed through then, I wouldn't have made all those positive changes. So in my junior year, when I kind of found myself back at that dark place, because I pushed through, I made a lot of improvement. I was able to do more things I was passionate about, get into a college, get the scholarship of my dreams. I was able to do a lot of positive things. And while I found myself, back at that dark spot again, I again pushed through, kept moving forward. And because of that, I continue to see more success. It's hard in those moments when you're in those dark places to remember that this is just temporary, and that, you know, you're not going to be overwhelmed forever. You're not going to be dealing with these feelings of sadness. And, you know, I've been in those spots, and it's extremely difficult to push through. But the thing you have to remember is, as long as you don't give up, you'll be able to make the changes that you want in your life in order for you to, you know, get the happiness that you deeply desire. At least that's what I found in my experience, is when I pushed through those points and I just kept trying, things would get much better than I had ever imagined. So in that point in junior year, I never would have imagined going to that college, getting that scholarship, getting the opportunities that I got. Because I pushed through, I was able to get that. And my senior year, when I pushed through again, I got through COVID as well, which was, you know, a difficult time for everyone. But I, you know, found things I was passionate about again. I focused my ambition on, you know, programming, because that was something I was getting more and more into. I focused again on exercise, on eating healthy, meditation, mindfulness. I started, you know, staying off my phone more and more. I deleted all my social media at that time. And all of these things helped me, and I became much more confident in myself and happy. And so once college started, it was definitely a difficult experience at first, because college was, you know, a very new environment. You know, I was completely on my own. I didn't have parental supervision. And the first year was fairly, it wasn't too bad because it was COVID. I didn't really see many people. Um, but I was still, you know, had a lot of struggles with mental health. I had issues with a lot of my, you know, friends there. It was hard for me to openly communicate my needs with people. And at the time, still, I was undiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So my freshman year of college, it wasn't, you know, amazing. I had my struggles, I had my difficulties, but this year I didn't find myself at that point where I was completely suicidal again, which was a huge improvement over the past couple of years. Because while I did struggle and I did have hardship, again, because I pushed through those points, my lows weren't getting as low anymore. I was still having hard times, but I wasn't crashing as hard and as often. So while I still had bumps in the road, I was still making progress. So again, I want to emphasize, it's a non-linear journey to mental health recovery. You're always going to have bumps in the road, but those bumps will just become a little bit easier to manage. You'll be able to anticipate them a little bit better. So after my freshman year, I did a lot of work in AI, and I got my first research internship that summer. So the research internship was very difficult, but very rewarding. I really enjoyed it. And then in my sophomore year, again, I had quite a bit of a low. I really struggled a lot in my sophomore year because my anxiety got really bad, and my borderline personality was very out of control. But at the time, I didn't know that that's the disorder that I had. So throughout that year, I really struggled a lot. And then that summer, I wasn't able to, I had, you know, tried to apply to some internships, but because of all the mental health struggles I was having, I wasn't able to apply for enough internships to actually get an internship for that summer. So that summer was, you know, extremely anxiety inducing for me. I had, you know, extreme anxiety to like the point where I couldn't sleep. You know, it's hard for me to eat a lot of days. And it was a very difficult period for me. And at that point was when I started to realize I think I might have something other than depression, which was my original diagnosis when I got hospitalized. So my junior year, I finally did get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And then I started getting treatment, dialectical behavioral therapy. And once I actually got the diagnosis, started getting treatment, things did get a lot better, but there were still complications. So for a few months, I did extremely well. But then just a couple months ago, actually, in around March, I found myself again in a very, very, one of the darkest places I had been, extremely suicidal, you know, not being able to handle a lot of my difficult emotions. But again, I kind of what I've done every single time, I just pushed through. I kept on going, and I just took a break during those times to let myself, you know, take a week off from school. I didn't really, you know, do much during that week. Just stayed at home with my family. Took the rest of the semester. I just commuted and stayed at home because that was where I needed to be because I wanted the support of my family there. And so, because I was able to push through that again, I found myself with opportunities that made me incredibly happy and that made me feel a lot better. So at the time, I didn't think things were ever going to be better. And I thought it was hopeless, but because I pushed through, I found myself, I ended up getting an internship this summer now, which has been extremely satisfying. I've been able to do work with SEWA, and have been, focusing a lot more on doing mental health, and things like that, things that I'm really passionate about. And so it's been overall, up until this point, extremely difficult journey, just to kind of highlight like lots of ups, downs, times where things are going really well, and then all of a sudden I'll have huge crashes. I'll have a really hard time out of nowhere, and then lots of my progress will get lost. Sometimes you'll have a hard time keeping your grades up, as I did in high school, and then like there also were things where like my career was affected. It was hard for me to get an internship one of the summers that I was dealing with a lot of mental health struggles. However, despite that, my life has still been not only extremely satisfying and enjoyable, but a lot of my career opportunities have not gone away completely. Yes, my mental health has gotten in the way sometimes of me progressing my career, me being able to move forward. But a majority of the time, those hardships that I went through and the struggles that I experienced helped prepare me to become much better. Like because of like for example, in my freshman year, the research internship that I got was really prestigious, and the reason I got it was actually because I talked about my mental health struggles in a lot of my essays, and I mentioned a lot of the hardships I went through and how I was able to overcome them. And that actually really struck a chord with the people who interviewed me. And the same thing happened in a couple of other job positions as well, where like people ask me, like, what leadership experience do you have? The leadership experience I have came from my work with starting support groups for mental illness, working on psychology projects, and stuff like that. So overall, the kind of takeaway I want from like my story is that while things can be hard, and it's difficult to recover from mental illness, it's important to remember that it's not a linear journey. You're not just continuously going to be getting better. You're going to do really good, really bad, really good, really bad. It's very unpredictable. And it's a confusing, it's a confusing journey, but that's okay. The only thing you have to remember with mental illness is just to not give up. As long as you're still breathing, as long as you're still moving forward, you're doing something right. And that's the point I want to emphasize. As long as you keep on going forward, just one more day, you'll eventually get to the point where, the things that you're dealing with, they may not necessarily go away, immediately or overnight, but eventually things do get better. You just have to kind of keep pushing through those difficult emotions and realize that just because you're feeling this way now does not mean you're going to feel that way forever, which is, I know it's super hard when you're feeling that way to remember that. I totally understand, but that's just what I've had to keep in mind, and what you have to try your hardest when you're feeling that way. So now that we've kind of gone over that, and I've given a couple of tips on like how I was able to get through, I want to give a couple more concrete kind of things that students can try to do to help manage their workload, because this is something that's for me has been extremely difficult, and especially in the South Asian community. There's a lot of pressure. Like grades is a big thing. Career success, all of these things are very big factors that you have to keep in mind. What if you're a part of the South Asian community? So with that in mind, I want to emphasize that your mental health always does matter, and it comes first, because the reality is like, while school, career, and work, like these things are important, it doesn't matter if you have the best job in the world, the best career in the world, the best grades, if you don't want to be alive, if you don't want to be here, if you're going to take, if you're going to take your own life, there's no point to those grades. There's no point to that good career. If you're not going to live a life that's, satisfying to you, all these things don't matter. So that's the first point I want to emphasize. And I always try to keep in mind is that if I'm extremely unhappy, then not only am I not going to be able to get good grades, to do on my career, to bring my all to the things that I want to do, but there's also no point in doing all of that anyway. Your happiness always comes first. And so with that kind of, that's the way I want to frame a lot of this advice is like, don't ever feel like your career or your grades or anything matters more than your mental well-being. Your mental well-being always comes first. And if you don't put it first, your career, grades, all those things are going to suffer. So with that being said, some of the practical tips I can dive into is, again, the things that I mentioned before, gratitude. This is a big one. The easiest thing you can start doing immediately today, just list 5 things you're grateful for every day. That's it. There's lots of scientific literature behind this, but the practice of gratitude is extremely valuable and has been proven to help people feel better. It's really simple. You can get started on it right away. And if it's hard to come up with 5 things, just do 3 things, 2 things, even 1 thing a day. That's all you need. Just get started with it. The second thing is meditation. Meditation, again, there's so many studies on how helpful meditation is. There's a whole journal, scientific journal, dedicated to just studies on meditation. It's extremely helpful. Even if you're not dealing with mental health struggles, meditation is really crucial. And definitely you don't have to do it if that's not what you want to do. But if you have some interest and you can do it, definitely check it out. I would start with 5 minutes a day. With all of these things I'm going to suggest, start super small. That's how I started. I didn't start meditating for 4 hours a day and, becoming a monk. I started with just 5 minutes a day. And that's why I stuck to it. So start super small. So gratitude, just list 5 things a day that you're grateful for. Meditation, 5 minutes a day. Exercise is another big one too. And when I say exercise, you don't have to go run on like a treadmill. You don't have to go to the gym necessarily. You don't have to lift weights. My favorite exercise is walking. I just go on, 20 to 40-minute walks each day. I try to get, 8,000 steps in the day. Just simple things like that will boost your mental health dramatically. What I would recommend is if you don't regularly exercise, pick something that you like to do. So for me, I love walking. So that's why I chose walking. But if you like dancing, go dance. If you like playing basketball, go play basketball as your exercise. Don't limit yourself to just running or, going on a bike or something like that, or weightlifting. Those are just some options that you can do. But that's kind of the 3 big things. Then there's also eating healthy. I really consistently try to get in just 3 servings of fruits a day. So keep it simple. That's all I do. I just have like an apple, orange, banana at least. And as long as I have that, I'm good, and just having a simple habit like that to start, that'll really help you, because once you get in that habit of just having those 3 things a day, you'll, kind of start to crave healthy food. Then you'll start, reaching for healthy options when you go out to eat. Just let it slowly happen over time and start small, just like 1 apple a day, 1 banana a day, something super simple, and pick something you like. And so then other kind of practical things at school. So one big thing that helps me is planning out my day. I always plan out every minute of my day. You don't have to do every single minute, but if you have a lot of assignments and things you have to do, plan out when you're going to do them in a week. So like if I have, 2 essays due, 2 midterms due, and then I have like some project I have to work on for my like research lab, it's an overwhelming, stressful experience when I think about it like that. But what I like to do is I'll break it down into like hours and put it on my calendar. So if I have like this essay, I'll estimate takes me like 3 hours. So I'll allocate 3 hours on Tuesday to do this essay. Then I'll allocate, 3 hours to do the other essay on Monday. Then 4 hours to study for this test, stuff like that. Super simple, super easy. You can use Google Calendar to get started. That's my favorite tool. It makes all of this stuff a lot easier when you can see how much time you visually have in a week. It becomes a lot less overwhelming. And then the other kind of school related tip I would give is lists. If you find yourself overwhelmed with a task, the reason we feel overwhelmed a lot of the time is because we think that our capacity to solve a problem is less than the amount of resources that the problem requires. So if we don't feel like starting an essay, it's because we feel like we're not going to be able to finish that essay, or it's too daunting and too overwhelming of a task, and we don't have the capacity right now to do it. So what you can do is, instead of trying to do a big task, because it's usually things like writing an essay, doing a project, those are the things we put off. If you find yourself putting those things off, break it down into small bite-sized chunks. So for me, I rarely feel like starting an essay. I rarely feel like starting a project. But what I do is I just say, okay, I need to write this essay. I'm just gonna create a Word document. And so I'll create a Word document. I'll say, okay, what's the next small thing I can do? I can give it a title. So I'll give it a title. And it's like, what's the next small thing I can do? Okay, I need to put my name on it. And so it sounds like kind of silly to think about it that way, but when you break it down in these small, discrete chunks, instead of doing an essay, your brain now, like that's super overwhelming. But when you say, I just need to create a Word document, that's super easy. And so your brain will just go and start doing that. So breaking it down like that is a good way to kind of trick your brain into starting work. It's just, okay, let's just open a Word document. Okay, let's just put our name on it. And eventually, once you start doing that, you'll find that you're a lot more motivated to start going. So that wraps up kind of the tips I'd have for students. And so the last kind of thing I want to dive into is what can parents do to help their kids? So this is something that I think for me was extremely crucial. My parents were extremely supportive every step of the way, and that made all the difference in the world. I accredit a lot of my success to them, because had they not been as supportive as they have been, I would not be here today, and I would not be achieving, I wouldn't be able to do all the things that I'm doing had they not been there for me from day one. So what they did that was extremely helpful was that they always listened to my problems and made sure to understand, I guess, kind of the gravity of the situation. So a common mistake that a lot of parents will fall into, especially, if you're coming from a country like India, when you hear your kid complaining about life in America, it's kind of, it's like, why are you complaining? Because America is a lot, there's so many more opportunities here. It's so much more open. And you work so hard to get out of India to give your kids this amazing life. So it can be frustrating when you hear them complaining about how hard it is here, when you know how much harder it was for you back in India. But the thing is that when you have been born and brought up here, you don't have that perspective. And the issues that a lot of kids are going through are issues that, it's going to be issues that you can't really empathize with as a parent, because it has to do with things like social media, the constant pressure to do extremely well. Feeling like everyone around you is a millionaire living extremely happy lives and constantly going on cool vacations and all these things, because that's all you see on social media. It's a very new phenomenon that causes kids to feel constantly inferior, constantly feel like they're not enough, and it's extremely distressing to live with. So when your kid comes to you and says, like, I'm sad, I'm dealing with a lot, it can be hard. It might be hard for you to understand, but take the time to sit down and say, what's going on? Like, why are you feeling sad? And just let them kind of express how they're feeling. And when they do, you want to empathize. You want to say, it makes sense to feel that way. I can understand why you'd be feeling that way. I'm sorry that you have to feel that way. Those simple words that will completely, make that kid's day. They'll feel very heard, very respected, very understood, and they'll be more comfortable sharing with you in the future, and they'll be able to deal with those issues a lot better because they'll feel supported and heard. Another big thing is don't try to fix the issue. So when, my parents still will kind of do this as if because it's hard, it's a natural temptation. Your child says oh, I'm dealing with, XYZ problem. It's so hard for me to get started on my homework. You say, just get started. Let's do it right now. You want to kind of fix the problem. But the thing is, when you try to do that, it kind of scares the kid, because they're not coming to you for a solution. Oftentimes kids know the solution. And if they wanted a solution, they'd ask you for it. They just want someone to tell them it's okay to feel that way. It's okay if you feel overwhelmed. It's okay if you don't feel like doing it. I'm sorry that you have to feel that way. That's all you have to say. And then eventually your kid will start coming to you for advice. And when they ask, what do I do about this, dad? What do I do about this, mom? Then you can give them advice. But most of the time, you want to try and have a neutral stance and just say, I understand why you're feeling that way. That must be a difficult thing to go through. So empathy and validation. So understanding how they feel, putting yourself in their shoes, and then telling them it's okay to be having those feelings. So when you say it's okay to be having those feelings, it might not be like, you might not agree with what they're saying. They might say something that you don't agree with, but you can say, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I can see that feeling you're dealing with is extremely difficult. So you want to validate the feeling as much as you can, even if you don't agree with the action, because the feeling is real, even if you don't condone the action. So overall, just to summarize, tips and tricks for students and then for parents. So for students, gratitude, meditation, exercise, eating healthy, journaling, just kind of a quick one I forgot to mention. And then making a calendar, like blocking out chunks of time in your week to do certain tasks. And then when you feel overwhelmed by complicated big tasks, break them down into small, small chunks. And you can do this by asking yourself, what's the one first thing I can do just to get started? And then keep asking yourself that, like, what's the next step? Okay, what's the next small thing I can do? What's the next small thing I can do? And just focus on one thing at a time. And then for parents, empathy and validation. You want to try and put yourself in your kid's shoes. Imagine feeling sad. Imagine being, 16, 17 years old, 20 years old again. And imagine feeling those difficult emotions you felt when you were that age. And then once you're in that mind state, you want to validate how they're feeling. You want to say it's okay to feel that way. And if you don't agree with the action that they're taking in, like not doing their homework, or, like skipping school or something like that, it's okay to, not want them to do that. But you can still validate how they're feeling. You can say it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to not feel, like you don't want to go to school, but I'd still like you to go to school. Like I can understand that you're feeling that way, but it would be helpful and in your best interest if you went to school. So yeah, I've been talking for a while, but those are kind of the points I wanted to get across and to make. So now we'll kind of be moving into a Q&A session where you can talk and ask questions further about some of the things that we've discussed. And so I'll turn it over to Amrita.
Thanks so much, Varun. First, just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate your openness and vulnerability about speaking about your own journey in such a wide forum. I think many of us, myself included, have not been very open about journeys with mental health. And so it takes a lot of vulnerability and strength to be able to share. And also to be able to so articulately explain and reflect on some of the strategies that were helpful for you and be able to package them in a really nice and understandable way that like you did now. And I think your messages to both students and parents and broadly families or a community are so essential in that, one person's journey. I think you described a couple of times that, a journey with mental health can be very up and down, can also be very sideways, side to side and all over. And so one question that I can kick us off with is that everyone's mental health journey is very unique and very personal and different. And so in your sort of years and experience, how did you find other people to connect with or relate with on your own personal journey?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So when it comes to kind of finding other people who have been through this and finding kind of validation and support in that way, because I think that's a good point that you make, is because when people don't struggle with mental health and you try to, talk to them about mental health, it can be it can be kind of a destructive conversation sometimes, because they'll end up, they might accidentally say something like, oh, well, everyone goes through that, or, oh, it's not a big deal, or something like that. And that can, make you feel even more hurt. So for me, it has been crucial to find those people who do struggle with the same things that I do, who do have the same background. Because when I tell them, like, hey, sometimes, I just wake up and I have no motivation to do anything and I don't know how I'm going to get through the day. They'll, instead of saying like, oh, I guess that sucks, they might say something like, oh, me too, I've been there. And hearing those words always makes me feel so much better, because it makes me feel like I'm not crazy. And everyone needs that kind of validation, So the way that I found those is through two kind of ways. So one, the conventional way to do this is to go to support groups in your area. So at Georgia State University, there's a support group that I go to that's been extremely helpful, the Collegiate Recovery Community. So they focus primarily on addiction, but they also do general mental health as well. So I go there, and it's extremely refreshing to go there and talk openly about my issues, and to also hear other people going through the same exact things that I'm going through. So support groups are a great way to find other people who are going through the same thing that you are. And we are, in fact, actually, SEWA is starting a support group locally here in Atlanta, Georgia, for those who are interested. It's going to be a support group that focuses on youth. So kids who are, about 15 to like 22, we're going to say, high school, college age kids. where you can come and meet not just other kids who are going through mental health struggles, but other South Asian kids who are going through mental health struggles. Because, as a South Asian kid, you deal with specific hardships. So that's one great way to find other people to talk about the stuff with. And then the other way that I've kind of done it is honestly just by being vulnerable, by being willing to talk about these things. It's always shocked me how many people, like, I'll never expect it, but they'll always say something like, oh, I've been struggling with that too, or oh yeah, at one point in my life I also had lots of issues with depression and anxiety. Or even like some people, like, I'll tell them, oh, I have borderline personality, and they'll say, oh, me too. Like it'll really surprise me. So the one of the ways, it's a little riskier. You have to be careful with who you talk about these things with, and make sure that the person and you can trust them. But opening up, even though it is scary, I feel uncomfortable opening up a lot of the time. I don't really want to, but when I do, it's very often met with a warm reception, and the other person feels comfortable talking about what they've been through. And not only do they feel validated, but you will feel so much more validated by opening up. So yeah, the two tips that I have: joining support groups, and if you're in Atlanta, you can join the local SEWA support group that we're going to be starting surrounding South Asian mental health. And then also opening up yourself to people that seem trustworthy, and you'll be surprised at how often people will open back right back up.
Thanks so much for sharing. And I think especially the last piece around, being the person who may start the conversation is the way to find others. I imagine there was probably a day and age where we wouldn't be having this conversation on a Facebook Live. There has historically, I think, been a lot, and even today, there exists a lot of mental health stigma or lack of awareness. And so I'm curious from your perspective too, how you have seen the climate around mental health change and the discussions around it. And especially, I think, as, someone who's experienced it during high school and college, and particularly in that age group.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the stigma is definitely lowering a lot. Like it's become like super commonplace to talk about these things. Like I think it might just be because of like the kind of person I am. I'm really into mental health, so I tend to talk to a lot of people who are also into mental health. But everyone I talk about, like if I say acronyms like ADD, ADHD, BPD, BD or something like that, they'll all know what they stand for. Like it's very like open. There's lots of awareness about it. And people are usually, even if people may not be super aware of all these things, there's a much greater understanding that it's okay to have a mental illness, that it's not a character defect, it's not a flaw. Most people understand that a mental illness is something that you kind of have to deal with. It's something like diabetes, or something like that, where it's like, this is something you have, and it's not something that you wanted to have necessarily. It's kind of something that's out of your control, and it's not your fault for having it in that sense. So definitely the stigma has gone down, the awareness has gone up a lot, which has been very helpful. And yeah, like you were saying, this conversation wouldn't have happened, and I think just like 5 years ago. Because yeah, I've been able to do so many like discussions like this in front of a lot of people. Like I had a TED talk too, where I like talked about this in front of a large audience, and like everyone was very open to the message. There was not many people criticizing it, and I think that shift towards greater acceptance has been very positive.
There definitely has. I've seen a similar transformation, and it's great to have that environment. I am wondering, I think along with there being a lot more awareness around mental health and a lot more resources, there are a lot of people speaking about it, and there may not be all of the resources out there may not be the right ones or the best ones for us. And so I'm wondering how you can discern and recognize what are trusted resources around mental health information or professional, services to go to. So wondering if you can speak a little bit to that. What sources can we trust to help us?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, especially for kids who are younger. Because like, yeah, I'll see a lot of, I mean, like TikTok is kind of the biggest place where a lot of people will go to get like not true mental health advice, like, so there's lots of misinformation out there. And the biggest way you can discern it, at least for me, like even when I'm talking and even when I'm saying these things, be skeptical. Unless it's coming from a trained professional. And even if it's coming from a trained professional, have some sort of skepticism and go verify things online. So like when I, talk about things like gratitude, go look up like what are the studies behind gratitude. So like for me, like I've read a book, there's a book called Thanks. It's a really good book, but it goes through all the research for gratitude. And the reason I do it is because I've read that book, I understand all the research, and I know that it's very, very high quality research. Same thing with meditation. I always go to the research first before I do anything. And so that's the big first thing I would say is make sure that there's studies backing the things that you're looking at. Make sure that like you can find other people online who have, scientific literature backing what they're saying. And it's hard to read scientific literature, but typically like if you find, like a doctor talking about it or a psychologist talking about it or something like that, you'll typically be able to find a pretty accurate answer online. Even if you can't read lots of research papers yourself, there's lots of good resources out there that will at least tell you, like, oh, there's some research behind this, but not a lot. Or, in the case of something like meditation, there's tons of research behind it. And it's very recommended to use for a wide variety of things. And then the other thing I'd say too is trial and error. So there are lots of things that will work for everyone, but they may not work for you. So like that's definitely, I realized like that's the case for me, is like a lot of people will recommend things like, weightlifting or cardio, like things that get your heart pumping a little bit more. But those aren't for me just because, I have like knee problems, I have back problems, neck problems, stuff like that. So I get lots of pain if I'm doing weightlifting or if I'm running or stuff like that. So walking is fine for me. So if I try to, like force the science into my life, it wouldn't work. And I'd end up with, a lot more pain and a lot more trouble. So look at the research, see what it's saying, and then test it out on yourself. And if it's working, keep doing it. If not, that's okay. And then also there are tips that aren't necessarily like research backed because you can't really research these things. So for example, like, putting things on a calendar or like doing a to-do list or stuff like that. That's stuff it's kind of difficult to research, and especially in the context of mental illness, these aren't things that typically people will look at. But you got to try those things out. So there's lots of things that I've learned just through trial and error. So like a lot of those things might not be specifically research backed, but so many successful people do them, and they do work in terms of increasing productivity. That you can kind of focus on those. And then even if there's things that don't have research backing them, so like like I take magnesium tablets every day. So there's not a ton of research backing like magnesium and zinc. But for me personally, those were a game changer. Like once I started taking those, I felt a lot better, a lot more energy, a lot more clarity. So yeah, the 4 camps is like well-researched stuff that works for you, well-researched stuff that doesn't work for you, you can avoid it. Stuff that has no research, but it works for you, you can keep doing it. And the stuff that has some research, again, if it works for you, keep it, but if not, discard it.
Thanks so much for sharing. There's so much information out there nowadays, and sometimes even strategies on how to filter through that are very helpful. We're starting to get some questions and comments in the chat. So one question that I wanted to ask is that how do we cope with or respond to someone who may be experiencing crisis? And as a follow-up to that, what if that person is not maybe willing or ready to accept our support?
Okay, so I think that's a fantastic question. So crisis situations are extremely difficult to deal with. And so I work for a crisis text line, like I volunteer there. So I've worked with a lot of people who are in crisis, who, are like on the verge of suicide or something like that. And the first thing I'll say is that, again, you want to go back to that point of empathy and validation. So you don't want to try and come up with solutions when someone is in crisis. You don't want to try and, help like fix their emotion or anything like that. You just want to, again, say, I empathize with how you're feeling. Like I'm sorry that you feel this way. I can imagine that it's extremely difficult to deal with that. Could you tell me more about it? You want them to feel like the way that they're feeling is okay to feel that way. There's nothing wrong with them. And you want to give them space to share about what it is they're going through. So yeah, the two things, empathy and validation. Put yourself in their shoes, imagine what it's like to feel like that, and then be like, it's okay to feel that way. I'm sorry you feel that way. And then let them share about what they're feeling. And then and the other thing is, don't focus on solutions, because usually people in crisis, they're not in that headspace to focus on solutions. So just try to talk to them a little bit. And once they start to feel a little bit better, they're calming down, then you can start focusing on solutions. But in the case where someone isn't ready to receive your help, or they just can't calm down, you will need to, like, start taking things to a professional. So, or if not necessarily a professional, but you can do something like called text crisis text line. So that's super helpful resource, crisis text line. You can send them a text, and there'll be a professional person there who's trained to handle these crisis situations that'll help them de-escalate and calm down. Or you can call the suicide hotline as well. 988, I believe, is the number now. So you just dial that, you call it. They're super helpful. I personally use the suicide hotline. Extremely, extremely helpful. You'll feel a lot better, at least in my experience. And when you yourself cannot handle a crisis, that's okay. Like you're not going to be expected to be a mental health professional or know how to deal with these situations. It's okay to hand it off to someone else. But just be there all that you can. Don't try to solve the situation. And if you can't do anything about it, hand it over to something like crisis text line or suicide hotline. And if it still continues to escalate, then emergency services are, that's, you typically want to save that for last, because, emergency services are typically when things are like very out of control. But if it gets to that point, it's better to be safe than sorry in those situations. Like you would rather have, your kid or your friend stay alive one more day, and play it a little bit safer than have them, be gone because you were too hesitant to call emergency services. So that's overall advice: empathy, validation, understand more, let them vent, let them talk about how they're feeling. If you can't help, crisis text line or suicide hotline 988, both great resources. And then if all else fails, emergency services.
Thanks for outlining those various resources and options if we're experiencing an immediate crisis. I think outside of crisis situations, I think you have spoken a little bit about different professional resources that we can reach out to. Where would one start in trying to identify how to access professional resources? How do we know what is the right fit for myself?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the big thing with therapy is your insurance. Like you want to make sure your therapist is in network. So the way that I found my therapist is really good. She's been super helpful. I went on, like, your insurance should have like a website you can go on where you can look up providers, who are covered by your insurance. So go on there, look up therapists, and look up the specific issue that you want to get help with. So for me, like I think we have United Healthcare. So like I went to their website, and then I looked up like borderline personality disorder therapists who specialize in like DBT. So I put on all those filters, and then I went through just each therapist, looked them up online, looked at if there were any reviews. I went on their Psychology Today page. I read their bio. And usually by reading the bio, seeing if they have any reviews, and seeing their like page on Psychology Today, you'll be able to see like, will this person be a good fit? And then from there, you can narrow down. Like I would go through about 20 different therapists. I would narrow down maybe like 3 that you like, and then try each kind of one by one. So like that's kind of what I did. So I started with the therapist. She was really good fit, really liked her, but she specialized in like OCD and anxiety, which those weren't my big struggles. My bigger struggle was BPD. So I switched my therapist over to one that specialized in BPD and in OCD and anxiety. And then she was able to help me a lot. So yeah, one big thing to know is, even if your therapist is a good fit, if they don't specialize in the thing that you are dealing with, they cannot be of much help sometimes. Especially for things like borderline personality or something like that, or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, you need a therapist who's going to specialize in the thing that you're doing because they're very unique illnesses. And then the other thing too is for psychiatry, same exact process, go on your insurance provider's website, look at psychiatrists and look at psychiatrists who, again, specialize in the thing that you are dealing with personally. So if you're dealing with bipolar, go to a psychiatrist, the one who specializes in that. And if your question is, how do I even know what I have? Like I'm not sure what I have. Then you want to just find a psychologist who's a little more general purpose. I kind of went online, I looked through some things like, okay, these are the kind of disorders I resonate with a lot. Usually by looking up some general symptoms, you don't want to self-diagnose, but you can be like, okay, I think I kind of, I looked at borderline personality symptoms. And like, okay, I identify with a lot of these, but like I looked at like ADHD and I was like, I don't identify with any of these. So going online just to get a general sense of what you may have, and then finding a psychologist who specializes in those potential disorders you think you may be struggling with, who can help you figure out like, okay, do you really have this diagnosis, or might it be something else? So yeah, overall tips: psychologists and psychiatrists. Go on your healthcare provider site and search for a specific disorder that you're struggling with. And then if you don't know what disorder you have, look for a psychologist or psychiatrist. Psychiatrist or psychologist both can help diagnose you. And find one that's specialized in the thing that you think you may have, just based on a preliminary kind of search of like symptoms and things that you've seen online.
Thanks for outlining those options. Maybe a few more notes that I can add to that too is that sometimes just your, primary care provider can also be a great place to start if we're going for a routine visit. They can also provide some referrals or support and direct you to the right resources in some way. I think, Varun, you also spoke to some of the cultural differences that exist around mental health and mental illness. And so nowadays, there are really great filters on some of these websites to see if providers speak a certain language, to understand what background they come from. Some of them identify what types of clients with certain backgrounds that they are open to and comfortable working with. And so that can be really helpful because it's such a personal process to identify someone who may understand where you're coming from. I think we're nearing the end of our time, and so just wanted to ask for your final comments, Varun, and then I can wrap up our webinar for today and share some just additional resources and how we can carry this discussion forward.
Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of wrap up by saying, thank you, Amruta, for moderating and doing a great job and having great questions as well. Thank you to people who asked questions in the chat, and for everyone who is able to attend and everyone who's viewing after this has been posted. Yeah, I'm grateful that I got the opportunity to come and speak about this and share my experience. And the other thing that I kind of want to just reemphasize again is that if you're in Atlanta or in like the Georgia area, we are having a support group for South Asian youth. So if you are dealing with these mental health struggles and you want a place to go and talk about these things and just express them with other kids, who look like you, who are from the same background as you, who understand the struggles you're going through, this support group is for you. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be running it. I can, if you, want to talk to me about those things at the support group, I can help, help you with any things that you're going through, stuff like that. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, I'll let you kind of wrap it up, Amruta.
Thanks so much, Varun, again for the opportunity to have this discussion. I'm glad that both of us could start this dialogue today and continue it. Along with all of the very helpful tips and resources that Varun shared, I also wanted to highlight some other resources that you can connect with Seva International locally with. There are, of course, the Family Services Program. So those who may be looking for any type of support during a mental health, if we may be experiencing mental health challenges. A lot of the tips that Varun shared were around some basic day-to-day habits that all of us can inculcate and build within ourselves. And there is the Know Your Healthy Self program, which stands for sleep, exercise, living in the present, or lifestyle practices, and food and diet. And a lot of the general tips for prevention and supporting our own mental health on a day-to-day basis can be covered through those 4 elements and along with a group through Save Us Self program. And of course, if anyone is experiencing a immediate mental health crisis, there's of course the 988 suicide helpline. You can also, of course, reach out to your local Seva International chapter if you are looking for other people to connect with around mental health. If you would like some longer term support and resources around your own mental health or well-being, or that of a loved one, and Seva International volunteers would be more than happy to connect you and support however they can. So just wanted to thank everyone again for participating in this webinar today and being a part of this broader movement to have more dialogues around mental health and destigmatize mental illness. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining again.